Hello everybody and welcome back to part 2 of our Hangman Pygame tutorial. Now in this video what we're going to be doing is really focusing on what I've kind of drawn right here, which is these buttons. So essentially a core concept of this game is going to be to be able to press on these buttons, which will have a bunch of letters on them, so like A, B, C, so on, and then have this letter disappear when you press on it and have that letter, if it exists in the word, show up here, right? So if I press A, then if the word started with A, it would show up here. If it contained A, it would pop up those A's everywhere in the word. That is what we are trying to do, and that's what this tutorial is going to aim to kind of do, is figure out, first of all, how do we draw all of these buttons? How can we click on these buttons? How do we make these buttons disappear and reappear? And that is a fairly challenging thing, but I hope you guys are up for it. I'm going to be explaining as best as I can all of the somewhat complicated math that we need to do to be able to handle all of that. So I'm just trying to get rid of that square there. So the first thing we need to do before we can handle any of the logic here is actually drawing these buttons. Now, when I make games, I like to make sure everything is nice and center. I want to make sure everything is perfect. And essentially what I want is there to be equal distance between the button on the far left and the button on the far right. In other words, the set of buttons, if you looked at them as one rectangle, would be perfectly center horizontally in the screen. So how do I actually go about doing that? Well, I'm going to explain very quickly here how we do that, a few other things we need to consider about drawing buttons and circles and all of that, and then of course we'll get into all of the code. So let me go to a red pen here, and the first thing that we need to point out is a bunch of variables that we have access to. So the first thing that we know is the width of the screen. Now remember, the goal here is going to be to draw all of these buttons perfectly center somewhere horizontally on the screen. Now what I'm going to do to draw the buttons is I'm going to use a for loop, and I'm going to start by drawing the very first button, and then I'm just going to add a certain distance, keep adding a certain distance, and drawing all of the buttons until I get to my second row of buttons where I'll keep drawing all the other ones. So the problem right now that we really need to determine is, first of all, how many buttons are we drawing, and where do we start drawing the buttons from? Because I'm going to use a for loop to draw all these buttons, so I'm going to start at some position, and from that position, I'm going to continue to add numbers till I get to the end of the row. Then I'll move down to the next row, which coincidentally will start at the same position that this one started at, right? And then we will continue the process. That's what we need to do. So what we actually know right now is we're going to have 26 total buttons, and of those, 13 are going to be in each row. So we're going to have 2 rows. That's the way that I want to do it. Make as many rows as you guys want, but I'm going to go with 2 rows, 13 buttons in each row. So what we now know is that if we have 13 in each row, we're going to have to fit 13 of these in. There's going to be a space between each of these buttons, right? So there's going to be some kind of gap that separates them. The button themselves is going to be a certain width. It's going to have a certain diameter, and there's going to be 13 of them. So using those numbers, we have to determine essentially this position right here. Where do we want to start drawing these buttons from? So I'm actually just going to write the equation for you, and then hopefully I can explain it really quickly, and we'll actually be on and ready to start coding. So the equation we're going to use to do this, and I'm just going to write all of it out first, is width minus, and then what we're going to do is we're going to say gap plus radius multiplied by 2. And we're going to take this entire thing and divide that by 2. And actually, let's go back here. I forgot one very important part of this equation. Oops, I do make small mistakes. Apologies here, guys. This whole thing times 13 divided by 2. That makes a lot more sense. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the width and I'm subtracting, we can make this even more clear, this whole equation here. So I'm subtracting the gap plus radius times 2 times 13. Now what this value is right here is essentially the distance between 2 buttons. Because when we start drawing a button in Pygame or a circle, we draw it starting from the center. So the distance between the 2 centers will be the radius times 2, right? Because that is the diameter, that's the width of one button, plus the gap. So whatever gap we want in between the buttons will be here. And the radius will span right to where that gap starts. So that is actually the distance between any 2 buttons will be this. So we multiply that by 13. Why? Because we have 13 buttons. So we want to figure out the total distance between all of these buttons. That's essentially what we're trying to do when we do that. Then we take the width and we minus that from this whole equation. So we're taking this whole length right here and we're taking the width and we're subtracting it. So what we're going to get is we're going to get a part here, and we're going to get a part here. So whatever those are, that'll be summed together. Then we divide that whole thing by 2. And what that does is essentially give us one of these parts, which is the start of where we want to start drawing the buttons. And that is the basic way to explain this. That's how we actually do this. That's how we get that distance. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on this. You're welcome to watch this back if you want to see how this works. But that's the basics of figuring out how we actually start drawing these buttons and the center of it. And then this next part, hopefully this will explain this further. I will note that this is a little finicky sometimes. I might not have done this 100% correctly, but this will pretty well perfectly center the buttons. And if you want to do this another way, that's totally fine. Of course, there's lots of different math we can use to determine where to start drawing these from. So don't worry if that was a little bit over your head, but now we're going to start actually coding it out. And worst case, you don't totally understand, try messing with the numbers and seeing what actually happens when you change things around. But I am just going to go through the math that we did over there and just start kind of discussing how we actually use those numbers that we figured out. Again, there might be a simpler way to do this. This is the way that I came up with. So if you do know a simpler way, please do let me know in the comments. The first thing that I'm going to do is actually just make a, another comment up here, and I'm going to say button vars just for variables. We could type variables, so button variables, and I'm going to say radius equals, and then in this case, I'm going to put a radius of 20. Now, I'm also going to define a gap size. The gap size I want to use is 15. So we do want a gap, and we do want 15 to be that gap, and then radius of 20. Now down here, and actually, you know what? We can do it right up here with the button variables. We don't need to go any lower. I'm going to go ahead and say buttons, or actually letters, sorry, is equal to an empty list. And this is where I'm going to store all of the buttons that I'm about to create. And then what I'm going to do is have a start X and a start Y variable that I'm going to have to set up here. So start X, we talked about how to calculate that. I want to figure out where we're going to start the X position. So to do that, we're simply going to say, and this is a little bit complicated, round the width minus, and then in here, we're going to say radius times 2 plus gap, like that, multiplied by 13, and then we're going to take this entire thing and we're going to divide that by 2. So essentially what we discussed, the width of the screen, which we already have that variable for, minus the radius times 2 plus gap, all of this will be multiplied by 13, so we'll subtract the width from that, and then we'll divide that by 2. For the start Y, we're just going to pick a constant value of 400. This is because we don't want it to be perfectly centered. We just want to start at some Y position. The X is a lot more important than the Y is. All right, next we're going to make a for loop, and we're going to say for I in range, and we're going to put 26 inside of here, and I'm going to say X equals and Y equals. What we're going to do in this for loop is determine the X position and Y position for each button. So essentially, we're going to start with button 0. We're going to figure out X, Y, where we should draw that. And then after we do that, I'm going to explain how we can actually implement letters and draw those onto the buttons, or like make the buttons with letters. So we're going to say X equals, now bear with me here because this is a little bit complicated, start X plus, and we're actually going to say gap times 2 plus radius, I believe that's right. Sorry, yeah, plus radius, but this needs to have a set of brackets around it. And then we're going to put times 2 here plus gap, and then multiply this entire thing by I mod 13. Now, I know this is fairly confusing, and in fact, actually, let me just put another set of brackets here just to make it a little bit more clear. But let me talk about what's going on here. So essentially, each loop, we have this counter variable I that tells us what button we're on. Now, first of all, what does I mod 13 do? Well, I mod 13 gives us the remainder of I after dividing by 13. So if I is 13, then I mod 13 is 0 because they evenly divide, there's no remainder. If I is 1, then the remainder is 1. If I is 2, the remainder is 2, right? And if I is 15, the remainder is 2. So essentially what this is trying to do for us is simulate like having 2 rows. Since I have I mod 13, this means that up until 13, I will just count normally, and this can just be treated like it's I. And then as soon as we hit 13, it'll start recounting again, starting at 0, going up to 13. That is kind of the goal of putting I mod 13. Now, the reason I'm multiplying this by radius times 2 plus gap is because that's the distance between each new button that's drawn. right? I have radius times 2 plus gap. So if you do radius times 2, that is, the buttons would be right beside each other if you place them like that. And then you add the gap, and now that's how much distance between the last button. So that's why we have that. And then the reason I've added gap times 2 is just so that this offsets a little bit from where it would have started, so that there's actually a gap between the right-hand side of the screen and the left-hand side of the screen. So this seems like a weird thing to implement, but essentially we need to do gap times 2 just so that we stay a little bit offset from the edge of the screen. That's what we're trying to do with this gap times 2. You can try to remove it, and you'll see what happens when you remove that. Now for y, this one's a lot easier. We're going to say start y, and we're simply going to multiply this by, and we're going to go I, integer division 13, and then, actually, do we need to, we can do plus, but we'll just do multiply because it doesn't matter here. Actually, sorry, let's do a plus sign. My bad on that. We're going to do start x plus, and then inside of the set of brackets, I, integer division 13, which I'll talk about in a second, multiplied by, and then inside of here, we're going to say gap plus radius times 2. So that's what we want here. So essentially what integer division says is that whatever the actual division is, excluding the decimal point, is the answer to this. So if we had 3 integer division 13, the answer is 0 because 3 does not go into 13 evenly, right? If we had 13 divided by 13, or integer divided by 13, the answer would be 1. If we had 14 integer divided by 13, the answer would be 1 because we're not taking any remainder, we're not taking any decimal point, we're just taking the whole number division. That's what that says. Okay, so once we have that, now we have the x, y position, and what we're going to do is we're going to say letters dot append, and we're actually going to put in another list like this, x, y. So essentially, we're going to make a bunch of pairs. Why do I keep typing a period? X, Y. We're going to put a bunch of pairs of X, Y values into this list. So this list at the end will look something like this, right? Like 25, 30, right? And then it'll have another set, and it'll go like 40, 55, or whatever, something like that, okay? It'll have a bunch of pairs inside of that list. So that's what we're doing, and then we're going to take all of those pairs and draw them to the screen. In fact, we're going to do that now so I can show you how to draw some circles, and then we'll actually put the text onto those buttons, which will be a little more complicated again. So what I'm actually going to do is, because we're going to be doing a lot of drawing stuff, I want to do that in one separate area, and I actually want to do that inside of a function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a function. I'm going to call this draw. The way a function works, if you haven't seen it before, is essentially you just make something, you put a name, you put a set of brackets like this, and then to actually call this function, you write the name of the function and another set of brackets. What this does is it will execute all of the code that's inside of this function. So for example, if I said print x like that, and then I go ahead and I write draw like this, then we will go ahead and we will print, sorry, not x, let's just say print 5, we'll print 5. And I can call draw as many times as I want, and every time I call it, no matter where I am in the program, it will immediately jump to where this function is and do whatever is inside of it. That's the very basics of functions. I don't want to explain too much more. So inside of here, what I'm going to do is take all of the drawing stuff I've been doing and put it in here. So I'm going to take these 3 lines here, which are blitting things to the screen and actually drawing something, right? I'm going to take those and I'm going to put them inside this function. Now, all I have to do is replace them with the word draw, and what this will do is call this loop, and every single time it will run this. So every time that we hit this draw function, so every loop, we will run whatever code is in here and just draw it. So it's just kind of a substitution. All right, so inside of here, I want to draw my buttons. So I'm going to add a comment. I'm going to say draw buttons like this. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for, and we'll just say letter in letters. Now I know this seems like a weird name, but we'll see why we're going to do that in a second. And what we'll do is we'll say xy equals letter. Now this seems strange, but what this will do is, since all of these are pairs, like all of the letters inside of our letters list are pairs, we can split them up into the 2 components, the x and y value, by saying x, comma y equals letter. So if letter looks like 4, 5, then x would be 4 and y would be 5. That's the way that we can do that. So that's known as unpacking, or just splitting up the variables. So we're going to do that, and then what we're going to say is pygame dot draw like that, dot circle, and inside of here we're going to put where we want to draw it. So we want to draw it on the window, and then we're going to put the color that we want to draw. So I'm actually going to go up here to where we had our colors, and we're going to define a new color, which is going to be black, and black is going to be 0, 0, 0, like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to draw this with black. So we're just going to put black there. So when we're going to draw it with the color black, we're going to draw it where? We're going to draw it at X, Y. So that's the center of the button, where we want to draw the button. That's the center of the button. Then what we're going to do is we're going to draw it with a radius. And finally, a width for the width of the actual button. So how thick is that line that's outlining the button? And I'm going to make that 3 pixels. So we're saying pygame.draw circle, draw it on the window, draw it color black. This is the center where I want to draw the button. So when we draw a circle, we draw it from the center, not the top left. This is the radius I want for my circle, and I want it to be 3 thick. So now let's actually go ahead and run the game and see what we're getting, because we're pretty much done drawing the buttons except for adding the letters onto them. So let's give this a second here to boot up, and let's hope that we didn't crash anything, which we may have very well done. And would you look at that? Perfectly, we have all these buttons showing up, and they are perfectly centered. And in fact, I think we have enough. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, looks like we have 13 in each row. All right, so what we're going to do now is actually draw text on the buttons. So to do that is a little bit more difficult, and the first thing that we need to do is we need to go to letters here, and we need to modify this a little bit. So rather than just storing a pair that has our X, Y, I actually want to store a triplet that has X, Y, and the letter that should be drawn on the button. So that way, when we press a button or we look at a button or whatever it may be, we actually know what letter we're talking about. That's the idea. We need all these X, Y positions to coordinate with some kind of letter, and we're going to draw that letter on the button, and when we click those buttons, we'll do something, right? And we'll try to guess that letter. Okay. So to do this is actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to make a variable called A, and I'm going to make this equal to 65. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because in programming or in computing, every single letter, every single character on your keyboard is actually defined by a number. And it just so happens that the uppercase A is defined by the number 65, which means every time you add from there, you go to the next letter. So B would be defined as 66. So hopefully you understand what I'm about to do here, since I have A equals 65. Every loop, I'm going to add I to A, and that's going to tell me what letter I should draw on this button. Because if I is 2, well, then I'm on my third button, because we go 0, 1, 2. So I add 2 to 65, I'm at 67, right? And then I would get, I believe, C, right? That would be the letter I get. So let's redefine, A equals 65. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go right inside of this pair, and I'm going to say actually going to say CHR, of A plus I. Now what this says is I'm going to take the character representation of the number 65 plus whatever I is. So it's going to take that number and it's going to convert that number into the character that it actually is. So that's how that works. And now what we can do is go inside of our draw buttons loop, and well, we can start drawing this text on the buttons. Now to draw text in Pygame, what we need to do is create a font. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm actually going to make a new section. I'm going to call this fonts, like this. So fonts, and then in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a font, and I'm going to say letter underscore font equals pygame.font.sys font, like that. And inside of here, you can choose any font you want and the size that you want the font to be. Now, what is the problem here? Pygame.font.sys font. I think this is correct. It is. Okay. And for my font, I'm going to go with Comic Sans. That's what I always pick for my font. And for the size, I'm going to go with, let's say, 40, but we can always change the size after. So essentially, we're setting up a font by going pygame.font.sys font. We're going to store it in the variable letter font. This is what the font will be, and this is what the size of the font is. So you can pick whatever you want here, so long as it's a valid font. There is a way to look up all the Pygame fonts. I don't remember how to do that, but you're welcome to obviously mess and change this font around. Comic Sans is just the easiest one for me to remember, so that's why I always use it. All right, so now that we have that, let's go to our drawing buttons. And inside of our drawing buttons now, what I need to do is actually draw the letter. So instead of just having x comma y equals letter here, because now letter is going to look something like this, right? It'll be x, y, and it will actually have a letter because we're going to have three things in our, I guess we can't call it a pair anymore, in our triplet. So we need to actually strip that out as well. So we're going to say x, y, and then LTR, which stands for letter, is equal to letter. So now we actually have the character that we want to draw. So to actually draw that on the screen, it's not super easy, but I will explain to you how to do this. We are going to, first of all, render this text. So using the font, we need to render the text that we want to draw on the button. So I'm going to say text equals, and in this case, it's letter font, dot render. You put the text you want to render, which in this case is just that letter, right? Then you put 1, which stands for anti-aliasing. Letter 1, and you put the color that you want to render it with. So in this case, I'm going to put black. And you can see it's showing me that suggestion here, but that is what we need to do to render the font. So text equals letter font dot render, what we want to render, the anti-aliasing, which I always just put as 1, and then the color that you want to render it with. Now, to draw this, we're going to say win.blit. So we've seen win.blit before, and then inside of here, we're going to put what we want to render. We actually want to render the text, or sorry, we want to draw the text, and where we want to draw it. So we could draw it in XY, and in fact, let me draw it at XY, and let me show you what happens when I draw the text at the same location as the buttons. So let's run this, and let's have a look here. All right, and we can see that these letters are not really where we want them to be, right? They are kind of hanging on the bottom right-hand corner of all of our circles. Now, why did that happen? Well, the middle of each button is the XY position, right? So when I draw at XY, what I'm really doing is starting to draw my, my text in the middle of the button, which means I'm starting at the top left of my text, because that's how we draw anything that's kind of square, which in this case is going to be our text. And it draws this way, right? Because we just go the width that way and the height down. We don't draw it actually right in the middle because we're starting to draw from the top left of all of this text. So what I need to do if I want to draw this text in the middle of the button is use a little bit more math. Always fun to use lots of math. So to do this is actually quite, I don't want to say quite straightforward, but we just say x minus, so inside of here for our location, we're going to say x minus text dot get underscore width. Now get underscore width tells us how wide this image or this surface that we've just created by rendering this text actually is. So it'll give us some number, and we're just going to divide that by 2. Now y, we're going to do the same thing. So y minus text dot get underscore height, so not width, divided by 2. Now the reason this works is because you have to imagine that where we want to draw these buttons, right, is right in the middle. So to be able to draw them right in the middle, we need to figure out where the middle is, which we actually know, it's x, y, and then we need to kind of go backwards a little bit from the middle, so backwards and up, so that when we start drawing from the top left-hand corner of our object, it actually draws the entire object in the middle. We're essentially trying to find the position of the top left-hand corner of our text, right? That's what we're trying to do. So by dividing the width of our text by 2, that's going to tell us where the middle of the text would be, and then we can just subtract that value, and that should draw it perfectly. So let's go ahead and run this and have a look here and see what we get. And perfect, there we go. All of our letters are now pretty well perfectly drawn inside of our circles. So we have A, B, C, D, E, you get the point. They're all drawn and they look pretty good. So that is pretty much it for actually drawing all of the stuff related to our letters and related to our buttons. Again, I know this is complicated, but since we want it to be perfect and we want it right in the center, we do need to apply a little bit of logic and a little bit of math. So now that we've drawn the button, everything is showing pretty perfectly, what we need to do next is actually check for collision with each of these buttons. Now, unfortunately, there actually is a Pygame Collision checking kind of module. I don't want to get into that, so we're just going to do this manually. But since we're using circular buttons, it's actually really easy to check for collision. All we have to do is check if our mouse is less than the radius distance away from any of the center of the buttons. Because if the center of the button is here, all I have to do is see if the distance of my mouse is further than the radius, and if it is, it's not inside the button. But if it's closer than the radius or equal to the radius, then it must be inside that button, because that is just how math works, right? That radius pretty much draws a line which creates that entire circle, and if we're within that radius distance from the center of any button, we've pressed that button. So inside of the event here, pygame.mouse button down, I'm going to check every single button and see, for every single button, what I'm going to do, is see if we've hit it. So I'm going to check if the mouse has hit that button. So what we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to change this to say m_x, m_y. So essentially, every time we press the mouse button down, we're going to get the x coordinate and y coordinate of the mouse. Then we're going to say for letter in letters like this. And now all I'm going to do is find the distance between the position of the letter, so the position of the center of this button, which is going to be x, y, LTR equals letter. I think we did this before. So x, y, LTR equals letter. Now I'm going to find the distance between the x, y here and this x, y. Now I'm going to put that in a variable called dist, which stands for distance. And the way to do this is actually pretty straightforward. We're going to say math.sqrt, which means we have to go up to the very top of our program and import the math module. So we'll do that right there. And we're going to say the square root of the sum of the difference of the x coordinates and the y coordinates. Sounds confusing. It's really not. What we can do is pick any coordinate we want. So I'm going to say x minus m_x. I'm going to put that all in brackets. So let me do another bracket here. What is going on? All my brackets are messed up. Okay, so let's do a bracket there, bracket here, if I can type properly, apparently not. And then we're going to do 2 asterisks, because that's an exponent, and we're going to plus that with the y minus m_y to the exponent 2. Now, the reason it doesn't matter if we pick x or mx, so the mouse position x, or the actual position x of the button, is because when we do this exponent, both these values are going to be positive, right? So we're essentially going to add the distance from the x, add the distance for the y, and take the square root. And if you guys are familiar with, I believe it's, I don't know how you say this, but it's like Pythagorean theorem. I can't pronounce that whatsoever, but you know what I'm talking about, the thing with the triangle where you get the hypotenuse. That's essentially what this is doing to determine the distance between 2 points. So anyways, that's what we're getting. We're getting the distance between the mouse position and the position of the center of the button. And then we'll say if the distance is less than the radius, then we press that button. So let's just print out for now the letter that we press so we can see if this is working. So that's all we need to do for collision. There's a few more things we're going to check after, but this will tell us hopefully if we've pressed the right button. So let me rerun this Pygame window and let's check it out and see if it's working. All right, so let me press a button and notice it says B, T, this says N, O, P. Looks to be working. If I press right in the corner here, that's not working. I have to press right on the button, and then it tells me what I pressed. Awesome. So that's good. That's functioning. Next thing I want to do is make it so the buttons disappear when I press on them. To do this is a little bit more difficult, not that much more difficult, but what it's going to involve is adding one more thing to our letters list here. So right now, we're storing a bunch of pairs. We're storing 34, 56. We're storing a letter, so like a string A. That would be a capital though. And then that's all we're storing, right? So we're storing a bunch of these inside of this letters list. Bunch of triplets that have the X, Y, so that's for the center of the button, and then the letter. What I want to do now is actually store one more thing with all of them. That's a Boolean value. So I'm going to go here, and we're going to start this Boolean value as true. Now, what this value is going to tell us is whether the button is visible or invisible. So essentially, has it been clicked or have we not clicked it yet? So all I'm going to do this is go into where I'm saying letters.append and simply add a field here and put true. And now what this means is that we're going to store 4 things in every single, well, now I can't call it a pair, but every single thing we're adding into letters, right? And that means we can check if we go down here to our draw loop if our button is visible. So we add one more variable here because now we're going to unpack 4 items rather than 3. And I'm just going to check if visible before I draw anything. So essentially that last value is telling us, is the button visible? Is it invisible? And we're going to set that to be false. So we're going to change that value when we press down on the button. So here, we're only drawing the button if it's visible. By default, all of them start visible because we start by having that value be true. And now, when we check for collision, what we get to say again is, first of all, okay, so let's say XY letter. We need to make visible here now because there's one more variable we need to check for. and we'll say if visible. So essentially don't check for collision unless this button is visible. There's no point in seeing if we hit it if we don't even see the button, right? And then if we actually have this happen, so we actually collided with the button, rather than just printing it, let's actually set this visible to be false. So let's say letter 3 equals false. The reason I can't just say visible equals false has to do with the way Python works with lists, and because what we're actually doing when we say XY letter visible is we're taking all the values from here and just copying them into these variables. I don't want to modify a copy of this variable. I want to modify the actual variable. So what I have to do is say letter 3 equals false, and letter 3 is going to be where that true value is held, because remember, we have 4 items, right? We have like 4, whatever, there's be a string here, like A, and then we would have true. So what we're doing is we're saying letter 3, which would be where this true is, and set that to false, so now that letter doesn't show up anymore. That's what this line is doing. So let me show you what happens now when I go ahead and run this. Let's have a look. And let's see. Okay, so when I press it, immediately that button disappears. So that is how this works, and that is the button collision, button disappearing, and pretty much everything we need to do for the buttons. So with that, that is pretty much it for this tutorial. In the next video, of course, we're going to get into actually handling the word. We're going to get into displaying that text on the screen, if you won, if you lost, all the other things that we need to make this game complete, but this was definitely the hardest part. Doing all the collision, doing all the math, getting everything center, and now it's pretty much smooth sailing into the last video where we add all the kind of finishing touches and last functionality. So with that being said, if you enjoyed, make sure you leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in another YouTube video.